The morning sun on Meridian 7 was peaceful and golden. Children played in the streets of the colony town, laughing and running between buildings. The colony had been growing for 15 years, and life had become normal for the 300,000 humans who lived there. They had jobs, families, schools, and dreams. They were far from Earth, but they had built something good. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the agricultural center, looking at the crops growing in the hydroponic gardens. The colony produced enough food to survive and even trade with other settlements. She felt proud of her work. Her teenage son Marcus was at the nearby learning center, studying physics. Her daughter Emma, only 12 years old, was with her friends playing a game near the colony's edge. Everything was ordinary. Everything was safe. Then the alarm started. The sound was unlike anything anyone had heard before. It was not the normal warning for dust storms or equipment failures. This was different. This was the sound of danger. Loud, piercing, and continuous, it split the peaceful air of Meridian 7 like a knife. Sarah's heart jumped. She ran outside and looked up at the sky. Her hands became cold. Massive ships were coming down through the atmosphere. They were not human ships. They were nothing like the smooth, clean designs of human spacecraft. These ships were angular, dark, covered in strange markings and weapon systems. They moved with terrible purpose. Within minutes, the invasion of Meridian 7 began. The ships fired energy weapons at the colony's defenses. The sounds of explosions echoed across the settlement. People screamed and ran in different directions, trying to find safety that did not exist. The military defense forces fought back, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. The invaders had weapons that were far more advanced than anything the humans could fight with. Sarah ran toward the learning center where Marcus was. The streets were filled with people running, many of them hurt, bleeding, crying. She pushed through the crowd, fear burning in her chest. Other people from Meridian 7 were also running toward their children, parents, or loved ones. Everyone understood what was happening. This was an attack. When she reached the learning center, it was already surrounded. Strange alien soldiers, tall and insect-like with hard armor covering their bodies, were pulling children and teenagers out of the building. These were the Xylotheians, though Sarah did not know their name yet. She only knew they were taking her son. "Marcus!" she screamed, but the wind from the ship's engine swallowed her voice. The Xylotheians were organized and efficient. They were not interested in adults or elderly people. They wanted the young. They pointed strange devices at the older colonists, and the humans fell to the ground, unconscious but alive. But the children and teenagers, the ones between ages 10 and 20, were grabbed and pulled toward the ships. Sarah tried to run forward, but a Xylothean soldier blocked her path. His eyes were cold and empty. He did not see her as a person. He did not see her pain. He only saw an obstacle. Before she could move, he raised his weapon and fired a pulse of energy at her. She fell to the ground, unable to move, unable to scream, unable to help her son. Marcus was pushed into a transport vehicle. He looked for his mother through the window, his face filled with fear and confusion. He did not understand what was happening. He was just a boy who had been in school, learning about the stars and physics, when everything changed. Now he was being taken away by creatures he had never seen before. Emma was also captured. She was with her friends when the Xylotheians found them. She tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. A net made of some kind of energy caught her, and she was dragged toward the ships along with her classmates. All of them were screaming for their parents. Across Meridian 7, the same thing was happening again and again. Young humans were being collected like harvest. The Xylotheians did not care about the grief they were causing. They did not understand love or family. They were simply gathering resources. Young humans were strong, adaptable, and easier to control than adults. The Xylotheians needed workers for the mining operations on their colony worlds, places where conditions were harsh and most older beings would not survive. The attack lasted only 3 hours. By the time it was over, 7,000 human children and teenagers had been taken. The Xylotheian ships rose back into the atmosphere, leaving Meridian 7 in ruins. Buildings were damaged. Many people were injured, but the deepest wound was the absence of the young. Sarah lay on the ground where she had fallen, finally able to move again. She stood up slowly, her body shaking. She looked around at the destruction, at the other parents who were also standing up, also looking around, also experiencing the same terrible realization. Their children were gone, just like that, gone. She walked through the streets of Meridian 7 in a state of shock. She passed by people crying in the ruins. She saw empty schools and abandoned homes. She heard stories of other parents, other families, all broken in the same way. Governor James Morrison sat in the colony's emergency command center. Around him, his advisors looked devastated. The colony's defenses had failed completely. They had tried to fight back, but the Xylotheian ships and weapons were far superior. "Get me Earth," Morrison said, his voice steady but filled with anger. "I need to contact Earth immediately. Send the full record of this attack. They need to know what happened here." One of his officers nodded and began working on the communication system. The signal would take time to reach Earth, but it would get there. The whole human race would know about Meridian 7. They would know about the children who had been stolen. As the sun set on the ruins of Meridian 7, Sarah Chen stood at the location where she had last seen Marcus. In her hand, she held his school uniform jacket that she had found on the ground. She held it close to her chest and cried, not tears of weakness, but tears of pain that ran too deep for words. She did not know what would happen next. No one did, but something had changed in that moment. Something fundamental had shifted in the human heart. The attack on Meridian 7 was not just a military action. It was a violation of something sacred. It was an attack on humanity's future, on everything they had built and hoped for. 7,000 young humans were now slaves on Xylotheian worlds, far from home, far from everything they knew. But unknown to the Xylotheians, this act of violence would set in motion events that would echo across the entire galaxy. This attack would change everything. The Xylotheians had made a terrible mistake. They had harmed the young humans, and the galaxy would soon hear the consequences. The night fell dark over Meridian 7, but somewhere in the darkness, in the hearts of every human who knew what had happened, something fierce and protective was beginning to wake up. A force that would not rest until justice was done, until the young were brought home. The message from Meridian 7 arrived on Earth like a thunderclap. The video recording showed the attack in terrible detail. Children screaming, ships descending, parents falling under alien weapons. The entire human race saw it within hours. Every screen, every communication channel, every news station broadcast the same message. The young humans of Meridian 7 had been taken. In cities across Earth, people stopped and stared. In Tokyo and New York, in Rio and Cairo, in Mumbai and Moscow, humans watched the footage and felt something shift inside them. This was not a distant problem anymore. This was personal. This was about children. The Emergency Council of Earth met within 6 hours. Leaders from every major human nation gathered in the Great Chamber beneath the ice of Antarctica. General David Torres stood at the center, watching the recording again and again. He was a military commander with 40 years of experience. He had fought in wars on Earth and in space, but he had never seen anything like this. He had never seen an entire species target children so deliberately. "We need a response," said President Maya Okafor of the African Union. "A strong response." "We need the Xylotheians to understand what they have done," said Chairman Wei of the Asian Pacific Alliance. General Torres stepped forward. "Then we give it to them," he said. His voice was quiet but filled with absolute certainty. "We show them what happens when you harm the young." In military bases around Earth and in human colonies across space, something began to move. Fighter pilots were called to action. Scientists worked around the clock to prepare weapons. Engineers made sure that every ship, every defense system, Every tool of war was ready. The quantum computers that had been designed with ancient military strategies began processing information at impossible speeds. They were running millions of possible war scenarios, finding the best ways to defeat the Xylotheians. For 200 years, since humans had first joined the Galactic Collective, they had been careful not to be aggressive. They had learned diplomacy, trade, and peaceful coexistence. They had been the young species learning from the older civilizations. But everything changed with the attack on Meridian 7. 3 days later, a human delegation arrived at the Galactic Council chambers. These were neutral spaces maintained by the oldest species in the galaxy, places where all civilizations could meet and discuss matters that affected them all. The human ambassadors carried with them the full recording of the attack. The council chamber was enormous, with representatives from hundreds of species sitting in organized sections. Some of the council members were beings of pure energy. Others were gigantic creatures with tentacles or wings. Some were silicon-based life forms that nobody truly understood. But all of them were watching as the humans presented their case. Ambassador Helen Rodriguez stood in the center of the chamber. She was a woman in her 60s who had spent her entire life trying to bring peace between species. Now her eyes were hard as stone. "The Xylothean Dominion has attacked a human colony," she said, her voice clear and strong. "They have enslaved 7,000 human citizens, including many children. We demand their immediate return. We demand reparations. And we demand justice." The Xylothean ambassador stood up. His name was Valdor, and he had represented his species for nearly 100 years. He had seen hundreds of species come and go. He had no fear of humans. "The humans exaggerate," Valdor said with what might have been a smile. His alien voice was like grinding metal. "We simply took possession of a labor resource on an unsettled colony. The humans are young, barely more than children themselves as a species. They do not understand how the galaxy works. We took only the young because they are adaptable. We will compensate Earth with credits. The matter is settled." Silence fell in the chamber. Every representative from hundreds of different species understood what the Xylothean had just said. He had admitted to the kidnapping. He had treated it as a simple business transaction. He saw no crime, no violation, no cruelty in his actions. Helen Rodriguez turned to face Valdor. "The matter is not settled," she said. "Not until our people are returned." Valdor made a sound like a laugh. "The humans cannot force us to return our workers," he said. "What will you do, Ambassador? Go to war? Humans have never fought a real war in space. You have no idea what you are facing. My people have been conquering and defending for 10,000 years. You have been out in space for barely 2 centuries." But he was wrong about one thing. Humanity had fought plenty of wars, not against aliens but against itself. And in those wars, they had learned something that most peaceful species never understood. When humans were angry enough, when the welfare of their young was threatened, when they felt betrayed by cruelty, they could become the most dangerous force in the galaxy. Ambassador Rodriguez did not speak again. She simply turned and walked out of the chamber. Behind her, the other human delegates followed in perfect order. The message was clear. They were done talking. Back on Earth, in military command centers and government offices, the decision had already been made. Every human military force was mobilized. Starships that had never been used for war were brought to full operational status. Training for soldiers was accelerated. Ships were loaded with weapons, supplies, and the determination of an entire species. The quantum AI named Nexus, designed with the strategic knowledge of 10,000 years of human military history, began coordinating the effort. In an instant, it could calculate the best ways to fight the Xylotheians. It could predict their responses and find countermeasures. It was not kind or gentle. It was pure, cold strategy. General Tours broadcast a message across all human networks. "Today, we answer the call that every parent knows. We protect our young. We fight for those who cannot fight, and we show the galaxy what it means to harm a human child. This is not a war for territory or resources. This is a war for the soul of humanity. The response was immediate and total. Millions of humans volunteered to fight. Soldiers, engineers, pilots, scientists, and ordinary people all wanted to help bring the young humans home. The entire human civilization turned toward a single purpose. In space, human fleets began to move toward Xylothean territory. They were smaller than the Xylothean forces, but they moved with speed and determination. They moved with the focus of a species that had just learned something important. You do not harm human children and walk away. The Xylotheians watched the human fleet moving toward them and laughed. They had fought bigger enemies. They had crushed species far more advanced than these young humans. They had no idea what was coming. They had no idea that they had just started something that would end their entire civilization. On Meridian 7, Sarah Chen stood in the ruins of her home. In her hand, she held a communication device. She had just volunteered to work with the military effort to help coordinate the rescue of the captured young. She would not rest until her son and daughter were home, and she was not alone. Thousands of other parents had done the same. The Xylotheians had made a choice. They had decided that human lives did not matter. They had decided that human children were just resources to be used. Now humanity would show them the consequences of that choice. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when you harmed the young humans. The first battle happened at the Kessler Station, a human outpost near Xylothean space. The Xylothean fleet came expecting an easy victory. They had faced many enemies before, and none had stood against them for long. They brought 300 ships, a force that had crushed planetary defenses across dozens of worlds. They did not expect 150 human ships. The human fleet was smaller, but something the Xylotheians did not understand was how fast humans could adapt. The ships carried weapons designed from ancient human military strategy combined with cutting-edge technology. More importantly, they carried pilots who were willing to do things that seemed crazy because they understood what was at stake. Commander Jennifer Park sat in the command center of the flagship United Earth. She was 45 years old, and her daughter had been on Meridian 7 during the attack. Her daughter was 17. Now that daughter was a slave on a Xylothean mining world. Jennifer had one goal: get her back home. "All ships attack Formation Omega," Jennifer ordered. Her voice was calm, but everyone who heard it understood the absolute resolve behind her words. The human ships moved with precision. They did not try to match the Xylotheians in straight combat. Instead, they used speed and coordination. They attacked in groups, hitting weak points in the Xylothean formation. When the enemy tried to concentrate their fire, the human ships scattered and attacked from different angles. The Xylotheians were used to enemy ships that fled or tried to defend a fixed position. They were not used to enemies that attacked with the desperation and creativity of humans. They did not understand that humans had nothing to lose except the lives of their children. One Xylothean ship after another was damaged and destroyed. The humans lost ships too, but they kept coming. Each human pilot who died had the same thought in their mind. They were dying so that someone else's child could come home. Within an hour, the battle was over. The Xylothean fleet had lost 90 ships. The humans had lost 32. By normal standards, both sides had taken heavy losses, but the difference was clear. The human ships were still advancing. The Xylothean fleet was retreating. As the battle ended, human boarding teams launched toward the crippled Xylothean vessels. They moved through the ships looking for human prisoners. What they found broke their hearts and strengthened their resolve. In the cargo holds of every Xylothean ship, they found human young, teenagers and children, thin and weak from poor treatment but alive. The rescue efforts were broadcast across all communication channels. The galaxy watched as human soldiers, with tears streaming down their faces, carried injured young humans to rescue ships. The sight of it shocked the other species who were observing the conflict. They had never imagined that humans would care this much about the lives of their young. They had never imagined that humans would fight so hard for them. Over the next weeks, human forces swept through Xylotheian territory like a force of nature. They were not invading to conquer or to steal. They were invading to rescue and to punish. Wherever they found Xylotheians, they fought. Wherever they found enslaved humans, they freed them. On the Xylotheian mining world of Cthres 9, young humans were forced to dig through impossible terrain, their skin burned by radiation, their bodies exhausted. They had no hope. They did not even know if Earth existed anymore or if anyone was coming for them. Then one day, the sky lit up with weapons fire. Human ships descended through the atmosphere. The Xylotheian guards, who had treated the human young as worthless animals, suddenly became afraid. They tried to run, to organize a defense, but the human soldiers who landed were too fast, too angry, too determined. A girl named Keisha, only 14 years old, was digging in the mines when a human soldier found her. The soldier's name was Major Anthony Williams, and he had seen enough cruelty to last a lifetime. He took Keisha's hand and said only 4 words, "We came for you." Keisha collapsed in his arms and cried. For the first time in months she felt safe. Someone had come. Someone had remembered her. This scene repeated across dozens of Xylotheian colonies. Human young, broken and hurting, finally finding rescue. The soldiers who found them, many of them young themselves, gave them water and food and wrapped them in blankets and told them the same thing. You are going home. The Xylotheians' advantage in numbers and experience meant nothing against an enemy that fought with the fury of a parent protecting a child. Their weapons were more advanced, but human weapons were good enough. Their military tradition was longer, but human soldiers had something the Xylotheians did not. A reason to fight that went deeper than pride or territory or power. The Nexus quantum computer coordinated every battle, predicting Xylotheian movements and finding the perfect response. But Nexus was cold, calculating logic. The real power came from the humans themselves, from the pilots and soldiers who knew that every successful battle meant one more human child coming home. Back on Earth, Sarah Chen watched the rescue broadcasts with tears on her face. She had seen Marcus. Just for a moment in one of the rescue videos, her son had appeared. He was thin and pale, but he was alive. He was free. The human fleet was bringing him home. Across the galaxy, other species watched in amazement and fear. They had thought of humans as interesting but not particularly powerful. They had thought of human space as a backwater region barely worth paying attention to. Now they were seeing something different. They were seeing a species that would fight with everything they had, that would face impossible odds, that would never give up as long as there was a chance to save even one of their young. The Xylotheians tried to reorganize their forces, to make a stand at their colonial worlds. But each defensive position was broken by the advance of human ships and soldiers. The Xylotheian military found itself confused and demoralized. They were used to fighting enemies that fought for honor or territory or profit. They had never fought an enemy that fought for love. General Torres sat in the command center on Earth and watched the progress reports. His forces were winning, but the real victory was not measured in destroyed ships or conquered territories. The real victory was in the faces of the young humans who were being brought home. The real victory was in the parents like Sarah Chen who would soon hold their children again. Continue the advance, Torres ordered. No rest until the last Xylotheian stronghold is destroyed. No stopping until the last human is free. The human fleets moved forward, sweeping like a tide across space. They left behind freed colonies and rescued humans. Ahead of them lay the Xylotheian heartworld, the capital of their civilization, the place where the leaders lived who had ordered the attack on Meridian 7. The final battle was coming, and everyone, humans and aliens alike, knew that nothing would ever be the same after it. The Galactic Council chamber was silent. Every species, from the smallest to the most powerful, watched and waited. The human fleet was in orbit around the Xylothean heartworld. In just hours, the final battle would begin. But first, there would be a judgment. An ancient being, a representative from the temporal observers who had watched civilizations rise and fall for millions of years, stood in the center of the chamber. His voice was like the sound of time itself moving. The temporal observers rarely spoke, but when they did, everyone listened. "We must ask the question that will define this moment," the ancient being said. "A question that will echo through history, asked in every school and assembly, understood by every young being who hears it." The chamber fell completely silent. "You harmed the young humans," the temporal observer stated. Not asked, but stated. The words hung in the air like a sentence of death. "You enslaved them. You broke them. You treated them as nothing. The Xylothean Dominion chose this action. The Xylothean leaders decided that human lives were worth less than profit." The Xylothean ambassador stood up to respond, but the temporal observer raised a hand and the ambassador froze, unable to move. "You will be silent," the temporal observer said. "Silence is what you have earned." Then the vote began. One by one, every representative in the chamber cast their decision. The humans were justified. The Xylotheans had committed an act that violated the fundamental rights of all civilized species. Every single representative voted unanimously. There was no debate, no argument, no defense. Ambassador Rodriguez stood and addressed the chamber one final time. "Humanity thanks the Council for their judgment," she said. "We will now enforce it." She turned and walked out. Behind her, every human in the chamber followed. In orbit around the Xylothean heartworld, Commander Jennifer Park received the message from the Council. The vote had been unanimous. The Xylotheans were no longer under the protection of the Galactic Collective. Their claims to territory were null. Their assets were forfeit. Humanity had permission to do what needed to be done. Jennifer opened a direct communication channel to Earth. "General Torres, we are in position. We await your orders." On Earth, in the deepest military command center, General David Torres stood looking at a map of the Xylothean heartworld. This was the capital of their civilization, the place where their leaders lived. It was also a symbol. If it fell, the Xylothean civilization would effectively cease to exist. Torres had a choice. He could order a complete strike, destroying the entire world. He could wipe out the Xylotheans completely, erase them from the galaxy. Many people on Earth wanted that. Many families who had lost children wanted complete revenge. But Torres was not that kind of man. He had learned something in 40 years of military service. Total destruction did not bring peace. It only created more pain, more grieving families, more cycles of revenge. "Execute plan precision," he ordered. "Target military installations, government centers, and weapons facilities. We destroy their ability to harm anyone ever again, but we do not commit genocide." "Understood, sir," Jennifer replied. The attack began with mathematical perfection. Human ships descended through the atmosphere with devastating accuracy. Each strike was calculated, each target carefully chosen. The Xylothean military command centers were obliterated. The weapons factories that had created the devices used to enslave humans were destroyed. The government buildings where the decisions had been made to attack Meridian 7 were reduced to rubble. But the civilian population, those who had nothing to do with the attack, were warned and evacuated. Human soldiers went into the cities and told people to leave, to go to the evacuation zones. It was an act of mercy that the Xylotheans did not deserve, but it was what separated humans from the monsters the Xylotheans had become. Within 6 hours, the Xylothean Dominion ceased to exist as a military power. Their ships were destroyed. Their weapons were gone. Their government was shattered. The Xylotheans who survived found themselves reduced from an interstellar power to refugees on their own damaged world. The Xylothean ambassador, Valdor, watched from a bunker as his civilization fell apart. He had laughed at the humans, had called them children, had thought they posed no real threat. Now, in the span of less than a month, everything he had known was destroyed. His people were defeated. His power was gone. His pride was shattered. Ambassador Rodriguez returned to the Galactic Council chamber. She stood in the center once again, this time as the representative of the victors. "The Xylotheians have been judged," she announced. "They have been defeated. They will no longer threaten any species in this galaxy. We do not seek to rule over them or to take their lands. We seek only to ensure they can never harm the young again." The chamber erupted in something that was not quite applause, but was a sound of acknowledgement. Every species present understood what had just happened. They understood that a new order had been established. They understood that the galaxy had changed. A young species, one that had barely been in space for 200 years, had just destroyed an ancient civilization that had ruled for 10,000 years. But more than that, they had done it not for conquest or glory, but to protect their young. They had done it with a purity of purpose that every species present understood instinctively. The temporal observer stood again. "This day will be remembered," the ancient being said, "not as a day of destruction, but as a day when a young species learned to protect what mattered most, when love proved stronger than ancient power, when the desire to save the young was worth everything." Sarah Chen stood in the rescue center on Meridian 7. Around her, thousands of young humans were arriving back home. Ships after ships descended, carrying the freed slaves. Families reunited after months of separation. Parents holding their children. Children crying from relief and joy. Marcus ran into his mother's arms. He was thinner than before. His eyes had seen things that no 17-year-old should see. But he was home. Emma was there too, pale and weakened, but alive and safe. Sarah held both her children and cried tears of relief and gratitude. Across the galaxy, this scene repeated. Families came back together. The young humans who had been enslaved were home. They had survived. They would heal. And the galaxy would never forget what had made that possible. General Torres received the final casualty count. Over 10,000 human soldiers had died in the campaign. Another 5,000 were wounded. It was a terrible price. But against the price of losing 7,000 young humans to slavery, it was a price that humanity had been willing to pay. In every human colony, in every human city, there was mourning for those who had died. But there was also celebration. The young had been saved. The threat had been removed. Humanity had proved something to the galaxy that day. They had proved that you do not mess with human families. You do not harm human children. And if you do, you will face a response that will echo through history forever. The Xylothean dominion was no more. Not because humans were cruel or evil, but because humans understood something that most species had forgotten. Love is the most powerful force in the universe, and the drive to protect the young is worth any sacrifice. 5 years had passed since the defeat of the Xylothean dominion. Emma Chen stood before the Galactic Council, preparing to give her testimony. She was 17 years old now, no longer a child, but she had been one when everything changed. She had been 12 when the Xylotheians took her. She had been 13 when the human fleet rescued her. Now she was a young woman who had decided to dedicate her life to making sure something like that never happened again. Emma wore the formal clothes of an Earth ambassador. Her hair was long and healthy again. The scars from the mines had healed, though the marks on her body would never completely disappear. More importantly, the marks on her spirit were beginning to fade. Talking about what she had experienced, helping other survivors, and knowing that her story mattered had given her purpose. "My name is Emma Chen," she began, her voice clear and strong. "I am one of 7,000 human young who were enslaved by the Xylothean dominion. I want to tell you what happened to me. I want you to understand what it means to be taken from your family. I want you to understand the price of cruelty." She talked for an hour. She described the mines, the cold, the hunger. She talked about the other young humans who had not survived, who had become sick or injured and simply given up. She talked about the day when hope seemed impossible, when it felt like she would spend her whole life in the dark. And then she talked about the rescue. She talked about the human soldier who had found her, who had picked her up and told her she was going home. She talked about the journey back to Earth, about the smell of real food, about the feeling of sunlight on her face, about seeing her mother again. Every species in the chamber listened without interruption. Many of them had young of their own. Many of them, watching Emma speak, realized what they would do if their young were taken. Many of them understood, for the first time, the fury that had driven humanity to destroy an ancient civilization. When Emma finished, she asked a question that would become the most famous question in galactic history. "Do you understand now," she asked, looking directly at each representative in turn, "why humanity did what we did? Do you understand that when you harm the young, you harm not just individuals but the future itself? Do you understand that no price is too high to protect them?" The chamber was silent. No one answered because no one needed to. The answer was obvious. Over the following weeks, the Council passed new laws. Laws that protected young beings across all species. Laws that made the enslavement of anyone, especially the young, an act of war. Laws that made it clear that if any species harmed the young, they would face the united strength of the entire galaxy. But more than the laws, something had changed in the culture of the galaxy itself. Stories about humanity spread through every corner of known space. Stories about how a young species had chosen to fight for their young. Stories about how they had won not through being the strongest or the most advanced, but through being the most determined. Teachers in schools across dozens of worlds showed their students the testimonies of the human young who had been enslaved. They made it a required part of education. "This is what happens," they would tell their students, "when a species forgets to value the young. This is what happens when you treat life as a commodity. This is what happens when you ignore the most important rule: protect those who cannot protect themselves." On Earth, memorial gardens were built for the soldiers who had died in the campaign. But the most important memorials were the schools and hospitals that were built. Schools named after the young humans who had been enslaved. Hospitals where rescue survivors could heal, both physically and emotionally. Marcus Chen had become a military pilot. He flew for the human fleet, protecting the trade routes and the colonies. Sometimes, late at night, he still had nightmares about the mining world where he had been enslaved. But those nightmares drove him forward. They reminded him why the defense of human space mattered. They reminded him that his service was not just about ships and weapons, but about protecting children so they would never experience what he had experienced. Sarah Chen worked as a counselor for rescued beings from across the galaxy. The Xylotheian attack had changed her understanding of the universe. She had thought it was a place of peace and order. She had learned it was sometimes a place of cruelty. But she had also learned that it could be a place where love and courage were powerful enough to stand against evil. 10 years after the attack on Meridian 7, the Xylotheian remnants still existed on a few isolated worlds. They were monitored by human observers. They had no weapons, no military, no way to threaten anyone. They were allowed to survive, but only as a reminder. Every young being in the galaxy was taught about the Xylotheians, about what had happened to them, about what happened when you harmed the young. The Xylotheian ambassador Valdor lived on a remote world, tending crops and living a quiet life. He was old now and he would not live much longer, but every day he thought about his mistake. He thought about how he had misjudged the humans. He thought about how he had believed that numbers and experience and tradition would always win. He had been wrong. Love had won. Emma Chen returned to the Galactic Council one more time, not as a victim, but as a representative of humanity's interests in the galaxy. She was now 25 years old, fully grown, a woman of strength and wisdom. She had been through suffering that would have broken many people, but it had made her stronger. When she entered the chamber, every species present stood in acknowledgement. It was an honor that had never been shown to a young representative before. It was an honor that said, "We respect humanity. We fear humanity. We will never forget what you did for your young." Emma stood in the center of the chamber and spoke words that would be recorded in the archives of the Galactic Council and taught in schools across 1,000 worlds. "We are the young humans," she said. "We were enslaved, but we are not slaves. We were broken, but we are not broken. We were taken from our families, but our families came for us. We survived not because we are the strongest species, not because we have the best weapons, not because we have the longest history. We survived because we are loved. We survived because there is a species in this galaxy that will move heaven and earth to protect their young." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the minds of every being present. "Let every species in this chamber know, if you harm human young, the galaxy will hear about it. Humanity will come for them. We will not stop. We will not rest. We will not compromise. Our young are not resources. They are not commodities. They are the future. And we will protect that future with everything we have." After she finished speaking, something happened that had never happened before. Every species in the chamber, from the oldest to the newest, stood and showed respect. The message had been delivered. The lesson had been learned. The galaxy understood. The temporal observer, who had asked the question that had defined the entire conflict, stood and addressed the chamber one final time. "5 years ago I asked a question," the ancient being said. "You harmed the young humans. Today I ask a different question. Does anyone wish to harm the young humans now?" The chamber was completely silent. No one answered. No one even moved. The answer was obvious. The age of humanity's innocence had ended. The age of humanity's power had begun. In the years that followed, humanity continued to grow. New colonies were established. New technologies were developed. Humans traveled to places no human had ever been. But something had changed. Everywhere they went, humans carried the memory of Meridian 7. Everywhere they traveled, other species understood that humans would protect their young with a ferocity that transcended everything else. Sarah Chen spent her last years of life working with other rescue survivors, helping them build new lives and heal from their trauma. When she died, at the age of 92, thousands of people came to her memorial service. Not just humans, but representatives from dozens of species. They came because she represented something important. She represented the power of a parent's love. The story of what happened would never be forgotten. It would be told and retold, generation after generation. It would be studied in schools and debated in philosophy classes. It would show that evil was possible in the universe, but so was courage. So was love. So was the willingness to sacrifice everything to protect those you cared about. And in the far corners of the galaxy, when young beings asked their teachers about humanity, they would hear the same story. A story about a species that was young and new to the galaxy. A story about how that young species had been tested in the cruelest way possible. A story about how they had not just survived, but had shown every other species in the galaxy what mattered most. Never harm the young humans. The galaxy had heard that sentence. The galaxy had learned that lesson, and it would never ever forget. The epic of humanity had just begun.